So we've got the whole tale of Victor Frankenstein bookended here by the story of Robert Walton, who's trapped in the ice, who longs for a friend. Walton himself, who has been writing back to his sister. And Walton goes out of his way to try and give this verisimilitude to the story. And he even writes to his sister, "His tale is connected and told with an appearance of the simplest truth, yet I own to you that the letters of Felix and Safie which he showed me, and the apparition of the monster seen from our ship, brought to me a greater conviction of the truth of his narrative than his asseverations, however earnest and connected. Such a monster has then real existence, I cannot doubt it. I'm lost in surprise and admiration." So he has great admiration and surprise at the story, but he says it's real, it's true, I've seen the letters. And he even goes on to say that this story has taken a week to tell. They've been talking for a week to tell this story. And he has heard the strangest tale ever told, he says. "My thoughts and every feeling of my soul have been drunk up by the interest for my guest, which this tale in his own elevated and gentle manner have created." So Walton admires this man. And if we go back to the story and see the story as a story of a madman, and if we take it as a story of a madman, then how is it that Robert Walton admires him, unless Walton himself is mad? And if we go back and we look at it not as a madman, but as a man full of pride, how is it that Robert Walton admires him, unless, of course, Walton is full of pride? And if we go back and we look at it as a noble man brought to ruin and tremendous ruin, then in some ways that's metaphorical for what Robert Walton wants in a friend, because he sees it in himself, great man brought to ruin. So it's sort of like, no matter how we look at it, Robert Walton's narrating of this story of Victor Frankenstein reveals Walton to be in a very bad state. A man who has sought out the furthest ends of the earth, isolated himself from human community, cannot have connection to women except for his own sister, and who has these ideas of greatness and glory. For instance, the pride of Victor Frankenstein even comes out in this last bit where he's speaking to Walton. And he says of himself, "When I reflected on the work I completed, no less a one than the creation of a sensitive and rational animal, I could not rank myself with the herd of common projectors." So he doesn't see himself as part of the common nature of humanity. He has done something so tremendous that he's above the pale. He's above the rest of humanity. He's like an archangel, he says, who aspired to omnipotence. But he also says that he's chained to an eternal hell, so that he's like, again, like Milton's Satan, who was once this glorious being who fell to earth and now is chained to an eternal hell. Now this is the kind of friend that Robert Walton wants, that he desires. I mean, Robert Walton says at one point, am I going to lose this guy? I just found this friend, somebody that I can admire and see as a mutual buddy in my greatness. But am I going to lose him? Must I then lose this admirable being? I have longed for a friend, I have sought one who would sympathize with and love me. Behold, on these desert seas I have found such a one, but I fear I have gained him only to know his value and lose him. So Robert Walton's terrified that he's going to lose this friend that he just found. Oh, I found this guy and now I'm going to lose him. Again, there's something, I think, almost of a demented nature in Robert Walton as well, that this friend that has appeared suddenly is now going to fade. Further on in this section then, when he's thinking about Frankenstein actually encourages him to stay alive. And he says, "My unfortunate guest regards me with the tenderest compassion. He endeavors to fill me with hope, and talks as if life were a possession which he valued. He reminds me how often the same accidents have happened to other navigators who have attempted the sea, and in spite of myself he fills me with cheerful auguries." So Walton is alone in his cabin, trapped in the ice, and he's taking encouragement from this guy who is on his last leg, who's on death's doorstep, who himself has ruined his life, who himself is a raving lunatic. And Walton is taking sustenance and encouragement from that sort of man. Well, into this reverie and isolation come the rest of the sailors who say, if we break out of the ice, you need to take us home. We don't want to go on to the North Pole. The one who then responds to the sailor's request, which is a perfectly reasonable request, is not Walton, but Frankenstein. It's as though Victor Frankenstein, who, if we now take it as a character inside of Walton, a character who is in the mind of Walton, Frankenstein now is the thing that is encouraging Walton to speak this way, and he addresses the sailors thusly. Frankenstein literally in the text, is addressing the sailors. But if we read it as, again, a form of madness in Walton, it's as though this is the courageous side of Walton that's encouraging the sailors in this long panegyric to do that courageous and noble thing. Oh, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. This ice is not made of such stuff as your hearts may be. It is mutable, cannot withstand you. If you say that it shall not, do not return to your families with the stigma of disgrace marked on your brows. Return as heroes who have fought and conquered, and who know not what it is to turn their backs on the foe. A very rousing speech that he gives, and one that's very courageous and noble and speaks to the highest angels of our spirit, but also comes from a man who is slightly deranged. So it may be that Mary Shelley is being either ambiguous or being ironic, or perhaps she's being critical of this attitude. One way or the other, there's this terrible paradox in the fact that this rousing speech comes from this man who is crazy. After that speech, then Walter tells them to retire and that he would not lead them forth to their own peril, but they need to vote and find out what they're going to do. They all vote to go back to England, and he says, the die is cast, I'm going home to England, it's terrible, my hopes and dreams are dashed, but I'm coming home anyway. And he says, I've lost everything, I've lost my quest, I've lost my journey, I've lost my friend, I've lost everything, and I'm coming home now to you. In recalling the death of Frankenstein, then, Walton says that he died nobly, and he is writing basically to his sister about the death of his friend, Victor Frankenstein, when suddenly he says, I'm interrupted. I'm hearing voices in the other room. Now again, this is strange that he would be writing what he writes, because Mary Shelley may be giving verisimilitude to the story, where the story is becoming increasingly closer to the reader, in the sense that now we're actually getting the events happening in real time, so to speak. But it may also be that Robert Walton is himself writing all this down in a dementia, so that he is not really hearing anything at all. He's just writing these things down because they're in his head. I'm interrupted. What do these sounds portend? It is midnight. The breeze blows fairly, and the watch on deck scarcely stir. Again there is a sound as of a human voice, but hoarser. It comes from the cabin where the remains of Frankenstein still lie. I must arise and examine. Good night, my sister. Now here there's a break. There's a caesura in the text, a split between what he hears in the other cabin, good night, my sister, and then what happens next, because he comes back obviously shaken from the scene that has occurred, and he writes it all down in the letter to his sister. Great God, what a scene has just taken place. I'm yet dizzy with the remembrance of it. I hardly know whether I shall have the power to detail it. I entered the cabin where lay the remains of my ill-fated and admirable friend. Over him hung a form which I cannot find words to describe, gigantic in stature, yet uncouth and distorted in its proportions. As he hung over the coffin, his face was concealed by long locks of ragged hair, but one vast hand was extended in color and apparent texture like that of a mummy. He sprung towards the window, and never did I behold a vision so horrible as his face, of such loathsome yet appalling hideousness. And at the last here, Walton is now seeing the creature himself, so that we get this sense of the reality of this is a real thing, because Walton is saying so in his letters. That's the verisimilitude Mary Shelley is trying to create. We also get a sense that the story, which was remote because it was removed by Walton and then Victor, has now become even closer to us because Walton himself has seen it. It's like at the campfire where you say, oh, I had a buddy who had this ghost experience, right? We hear that story and we think, oh, this is more real because Walton definitely experienced it. He sees this creature, this half-dead ghoul, hanging over Frankenstein. It's hideous. And then he has a conversation with it. But on the other hand, if the creature is a manifestation of the insanity of Victor Frankenstein, then now Robert Walton is also seeing the creature. And he's coming back to England with that seeing of the creature in mind. He has a conversation with the creature, and the creature says, I myself hated myself. After the murder of Clerval, I returned to Switzerland, heartbroken and overcome. I pitied Frankenstein. My pity amounted to horror. I abhorred myself. But when I discovered that he, the author at once of my existence and of its unspeakable torments, dared to hope for happiness, that while he accumulated wretchedness and despair upon me, he sought his own enjoyment in feelings and passions from the indulgence of which I was forever barred, Then impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I recollected my threat and resolved that it should be accomplished. The creature then expresses the idea that he is wanting to kill his creator because he is so lonely and he's been so forced into sorrow by his creator. It becomes very much an example of the hatred of the creature for its creator, like Satan for God or like man for God. And the creature later on says, "You hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that with which I regard myself. I look on the hands which executed the deed, I think on the heart in which the imagination of it was conceived, and long for the moment when those hands will meet my eyes, when that imagination will haunt my thoughts no more." So the creature is obviously an example of a being who hates himself and hates the world around him and hates his creator. He's filled with rage, just as Victor Frankenstein was filled with rage. He wants to destroy everything around him. And if, for instance, he is to be conceived as a part of Walton, Walton is now returning from the ice, filled with rage, filled with anger, in darkness, in a hellish state. At the very last, it says that he sprung from the cabin window. As he said this, upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel, he was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. So the creature, technically, literally, leaves the ship. How he got there in the first place, we don't need to ask, but he leaves the ship, and he promises he's going to kill himself in the ice so he will be no more. But if he's a vision, again, then he's a vision which Robert Walton carries with him back to England. And so Mary Shelley creates this sea voyage, which is also a hell story, which is also an insanity story, which is also a critique of the Enlightenment, and a critique of that whole modern vision that the world is a machine within a machine. And consequently, she creates this fantastic novel, which has layer after layer after layer of meaning and interpretation possibilities and imagery throughout it. A story, ultimately, of man's search for meaning and man's search for love and his failure to find it because of his own pride and his own desire for vengeance and rage. Vengeance and rage which ultimately make him damned to hell, and not a man, but a monster.